Stating the null and alternative hypothesis and type errors. When it comes to hypotheses, we use hypothesis testing as testing our belief about something in the world. So for instance, our null hypothesis is the default state of the world, and our alternative hypothesis is an alternative view of the world. So in the legal world, we would assume that somebody is not guilty, meaning that would be our null hypothesis. It is up to the prosecutor to prove the alternative hypothesis is true, that they are guilty. So when the jury makes a decision, they can either reject the null hypothesis, which means that the person is guilty, or they can not reject the null hypothesis. And this would state that there's not sufficient evidence to prove the person is guilty. So note the language, we are not saying the person is innocent. We just do not have the evidence to overturn the null hypothesis. Another example would be that the null hypothesis is that all crows are black. But we cannot prove all crows are black because we have not seen every single crow in existence. So what we would say is that we have not seen any evidence that crows are not black. So until somebody can show an alternative hypothesis and prove it, the null hypothesis is that all crows are black, and we don't have enough evidence to prove us wrong. When testing for diseases, we can state the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. What results would be a type 1 error and what results would be a type 2 error? Our null hypothesis can be shown as H0. And in this case, we can't be certain. We need to have proof that somebody has a disease, but we can't be certain that they don't have any disease. We can test them from 1,000 different diseases, but there could be diseases that we have not tested them. So, in this case, our null hypothesis is the person is disease-free. Our alternative hypothesis would be person has disease. So let's have a look at how we can get a type 1 and a type 2 error. So here we have our decisions. So we can reject the null hypothesis, or we can do not reject the null hypothesis. And there could be true outcomes in reality. The null hypothesis is true, and the null hypothesis is false. So, when the null hypothesis is true, the person is disease-free, so we can put that in here. And when the null hypothesis is false, the person has disease. So when the null hypothesis is true, the person is disease-free, but the doctor, whoever's testing for diseases, rejects the null hypothesis, so states that the alternative is more likely, what we would have is a type 1 error. So a type 1 error in the medical world is known as a false positive. So they falsely received a positive that the person has disease. So in this case, the doctor would begin prescribing medication. When the person does has disease, the null hypothesis is false, and the doctor rejects the null hypothesis, well, this would be a correct decision. They've determined that there is disease, and the testing shows that there's disease, so you can start to work on curing that disease. When the null hypothesis is true, so the person is disease-free, and the doctor does not reject the null hypothesis, we also have a correct decision. So the null hypothesis was that the person is disease-free. The tester or the doctor does not reject it, so they agree to it, meaning they don't have evidence to prove that there is disease. We have a correct decision. No action is taken. When the null hypothesis is false, so the person has disease, and they do not reject the null hypothesis, so meaning the doctor or the tester believes that the person is disease-free, what we have is a type 2 error. In the medical field, that would be known as a false negative, meaning that they should have determined the person had disease, but they got a negative when they should have gotten a positive, so it's a false negative. Now, type 1 errors are far worse than type 2 errors. So type 1 error would be when the tester believes that they have disease when they do not, versus the opposite. So this makes more sense when we consider it in the legal world. This would be like convicting an innocent person, and type 2 would be like letting a guilty person go free, where we do not we do not want as many type 1 errors. We're okay with more type 2 errors. So if we want to test a claim that the average monthly rent payment is less than $1,000, we can create a hypothesis test. So the claim is that rent payments are less than $1,000. So we would test our null hypothesis that the average of rent payments are less than $1,000, and the alternative would be that the average is larger than or equal to $1,000. We want to test a claim that rent is exactly $1,000 a month. So the claim says that the rent is exactly $1,000, so the average equals 1,000, and the alternative is anything else. So the alternative would be does not equal, sorry, and this should be the average, does not equal 1,000.